and I'm going to call the meeting to order. So I'm going to advise those in the public gallery that they're welcome to use mobile phones as long as they are in airplane mode and all devices must be muted. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any part of the meeting. I'm not aware of any apologies, but we do have two members joining us via Zoom and they're already online, so thanks to Anya and Aoife. You're very welcome, guys. And members, I would remind you of your responsibility to declare any interest under discussion today. So if there's any matters of interest, please indicate through the chair. We okay today? Yep.
Well, I declare an interest in a partner in a farm business. Just keep us right.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And yourself. And owner of a small farm.
Thank you, Declan. And I know we do this every week, but it is important to you guys. Thank you very much. Guys, in chairperson's business, you may have picked up in the media that there has been a confirmed case, and certainly we'll get the details of Asian hornet getting close to Stormont. So this is obviously something in the bee sector that this is a threat to them. So if you're content, members, we'll seek a briefing just from the department in terms of what steps they're taking in that space. We know that there hasn't been a bee master, a beekeeper, certainly a senior one here for a number of years. So certainly it's seen as a threat. So if we could get a briefing on that then, if members are content.
Do you want to written first?
Yeah, I think a written briefing would be fine in the first instance, and then we can act off the back of that. Members content. Thank you very much. Okay, the next item then, I'd like to extend my thanks on behalf of the committee to the Youth Assembly for providing a valuable evidence session to support the committee's scrutiny of the Dilapidation Bill. The session held on Tuesday evening was highly engaging, with young participants raising insightful questions and highlighting important issues. The Youth Assembly will now prepare a report outlining their views, which will be submitted to the committee as part of the bill scrutiny process. Members will have seen the news regarding the ongoing saga relating to the former Convent of Mercy on Pump Street in Londonderry, Derry, a Georgian-listed building dated back to the early 1800s that was further damaged in the recent storm Amy. The building clearly poses risk to passers-by and underlines the importance of the bill that we are considering. I'd just like to put on my thanks as chair for the work that went in behind the scenes with the Youth Assembly, the members of this team for hosting it, and actually it was a very engaging and worthwhile event, and anybody that missed it, I would urge you to try and jump on to the next one as if we do it again. Have you any comments, or are you content to accept the report as presented? Okay, thank you, members. Members are referred to page 3 of the table of papers to an invitation from Ready Egg Products to visit its processing facility in Lisnaskea, County Fermanagh, and to discuss its thoughts on the proposed NAP regulations. That's a visit that we had hoped to rope in on our last visitor. So we could add that to our list of invitations at this stage and come back to it. Is that okay, members? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Agenda item 4, minutes of the meeting on the 9th of October. I'm going to refer you to the minutes of our meeting from that meeting. They are on page 7 of your packet. Any comments? Are you content with the minutes as drafted? And if you are content, I'm going to sign them and they'll be published on the website. Thank you, members. Okay, matters arising then, agenda item 5. Number 1 is I refer you to page 6 of the table of papers to correspondence from the Minister dated the 14th of October in response to our concerns regarding the A5 Western Corridor scheme. Members, as you will recall at our meeting on the 2nd of October, we expressed disappointment the previous correspondence did not provide an explanation as requested regarding DAERA's application to intervene in Mr Kimmon's appeal against the High Court ruling. The Minister stated that due to an error, the letter issued did not contain the explanation detailed in an earlier draft, and now advises that the basis of the intervention will be to clarify the interpretation of the Climate Change Act 2022 so that it can be fully implemented as intended. The Minister also reiterates that in relation to our concerns regarding interdepartmental cooperation, DAERA remains committed to collaborating with the DFI to support landowners and farmers affected by the A5 scheme. So, members, any comments on this? Declan, you?
Yeah, in terms of the matters rising, it's in relation to the SL1 Farm Sustainability Standards regulations. You'll recall at the meeting we had in Carrickfergus, I asked the question, was a human rights impact assessment carried out, and the department indicated that a quality impact assessment had been carried out but not human rights, and that's not, and the SL1 indicate that a human rights assessment hasn't been carried out. And certainly, you know, in light of the, I think William and others raised about the proposed increased powers that are proposed, for example, to search computers. Yes. That there, I think, is an omission, and I think that's something that we need to flag up with the department.
It's a good spot, Douglas. I'm content with that. Are members content with that we will seek further clarification in regard to that and assess if it's standard practice in that space. And given the extended powers, as you say, it certainly is one that should be looked at.
I think William made the point at the meeting that day that the powers that are proposed are equivalent to like the powers of
Longer than the police. I think the William put
more powers.
More powers. I think William
more
said.
powers. So
Yes.
that's something we just need to be careful about. And certainly, it was clarified that there wasn't equality impact assessment, but not human rights impact assessment. So we need a.
Yep. No, very good. I appreciate that, Declan. You're happy enough with that, James? Yes. Yeah. Any other points to make on that matter of Declan's and the A5 piece? No. Okay. Members refer you to table papers, pages 10 to 11 for response from the Department dated 13th of October in reply to our letter regarding the agricultural scheme regulations, no 925 First Amendment regulations. As you recall, at our meeting on the 2nd of October, we considered the Department's response to our concerns about the retrospective impact on farmers who had already been penalised. Sorry, Anya, you've got your hand up there. Come on in. That face tells me you didn't mean to put your hand up, is that right? Oh, you did. Maybe you're just looking to unmute. Maybe do we just check for you? Just hold on a wee second, don't you? We'll take a wee second just to see if we can get you in.
That's me now, I think, is it?
That's you.
Yeah, Chair, just in relation to Declan's point there and the briefing we had last week in relation to the bovine genetic scheme, could we get some clarity in relation to the genotyping scheme going forward in terms of regulation? So, for example, will there be further regulation required in relation to making participation mandatory going forward? Or what is the situation or the intention behind that?
Okay, yeah, so as in essence, is it just strictly a participatory scheme in terms of sharing the information on the genotyping, or are there going to be implications based on the information coming back that might affect the eligibility for the payments? Would that be correct, Anya?
Yeah, and I suppose what is the department's intention going forward with this scheme post 26, if you know what I mean, 26, 27?
I'll just wait for a wee second, Anya, just to make sure. I think it's a good question. You content, team, that understand the question correctly, to transfer that to the department? Are members content then?
Yeah.
That we okay. Thank you very much, Anya. I appreciate it. Okay, members. Yeah, okay. You recall. Sorry? Apologies. Yeah, that's okay. You recall at our meeting on the 2nd of October, we considered the Department's response to our concerns about the retrospective impact on farmers who had already been penalised if the Department was found to have acted ultra vires. We noted the review concluded that no persons have been served any penalty under the obstruction of authorised person provisions using the Agricultural Act 1949 as the primary part. In response to our further query, the Department has now confirmed that the SR will not remove the ability for the Department to apply penalties going forward using the 1949 Act. Have members any comments on that at this stage? Are you content to note? Content to note. Thank you, members. Members, I refer you to table papers at page 13 for a response from the Deputy Chair of the Committee on Procedures dated the 4th of October in reply to our letter regarding the legislative consent motions, otherwise known as LCMs. Members, as you will recall, we wrote to the Committee outlining some issues that arose following our pre-LCM scrutiny last term and seeking a review of the LCM process, in particular around improved scrutiny time and resource. I know Michelle was really good in this space about highlighting the risks and the pressures that we are under to make qualified decisions on legislation that we can't actually amend, which is really, really important actually. So the committee informs us that is now will now add consideration of LCMs and Standing Order 42A to its list of priority work. I should declare an interest because I am on the Procedures Committee as well, so it's nice to see that crossover. It's nice to see the Assembly Committees actually demonstrating sort of cross-pollination and cross-committee work. Okay, members, we are now at agenda item 6, which is the Dilapidation Bill, evidence session with Propertymark. So I'm now going to refer you to the pack starting on page 24 for the briefing paper, detailing Propertymark's views on the bill. For reference, I also refer you to the table papers, where we have the bill and explanatory and financial memorandum, which starts at page 18. The raised bill papers start at page 52. And I welcome the following Propertymark representatives to give their evidence to the committee and to answer any questions. We have Mr. Timothy Douglas, the Head of Policy and Campaigns, and Mr. Stephen McCarron, Board Member. Thank you very much, gentlemen. So when you're ready, please do go ahead and give us your presentation.
Morning. Excellent. Good morning all, and thank you very much for the invitation to give evidence today. It's always a great privilege to give evidence to a Parliamentary Assembly committee, and we want to be as helpful as possible to its work. Anything we don't have details on or additional opinion is required, with the permission of the Chair, we will happily follow up in writing. I'm Timothy Douglas, the Head of Policy Campaigns at Propertymark, and joined by Stephen.
Thank you. I'm Stephen McCarron. I'm a chartered surveyor and an estate agent based in DAERA, London.
And as a quick intro for those of you who don't know, Propertymark's the UK's leading professional body for estate and letting agents, property inventory service providers, commercial agents, auctioneers and valuers, both chattels and property. Some of our members will do land and new homes, and some are in the block management space. We have over 19,000 members across the UK. Essentially, outside of Scotland, where you need a level 6 qualification to operate as a letting agent. In Wales, where you need a day's training course as a minimum to operate as a letting agent. There's no minimum qualification or entry requirements to operate in the sector, and we think that's wrong, should be improved, and all of our members are qualified, must submit annual continued professional development. We have a regulatory and compliance function, auditing activity and their accounts. So essentially championing the good and trying to outlaw the bad in property agency. And for agents certainly operating in Northern Ireland, where it's not a legal requirement to have client money protection, it's not a legal requirement to belong to one of the 2 UK government-approved redress schemes. If you are a member of Propertymark working in Northern Ireland, you have to belong to those schemes as a stipulation of our membership. So very much trying to drive standards up for agents across the profession, but also vitally for the consumer. So in relation to the bill itself, as the Chair's alluded to, we've provided written evidence, which hopefully offers some insight from the collective conversations we've had with members. And as an opening statement, I think just wanted to cover off 4 key areas which kind of summarise, our broad views, reflections on the bill. And I think, firstly, we'll give an overall response. Secondly, I put down concerns, but maybe more challenges with the bill and application, areas to potential improvement to strengthen, I think, what we've got. And then finally, some wider, more contextual issues linked to the sector and the marketplace that have come up following, as I say, our engagement and preparation with agents working in Northern Ireland for today. So I think our overall response to the bill is that it's welcome. It recognises that there's a lack of consistent interpretation from local authorities, which can lead to reluctance to use, existing powers to tackle unsafe or dilapidated buildings. But also, I think it's shining a spotlight for occupants, landlords, agents, and tenants to understand, what they need to do and take action. I think the bill has potential to ensure that properties in a state of disrepair are dealt with quickly, which prevents instances where unused or dangerous property is left with no clear resolution. And as I say, ultimately, I think it will increase the scrutiny of the condition, safety and appearance of buildings and lands in an area. And I think from discussions, not only could this improve quality, but I think it's about raising property values, reduce crime and ensure community space are better utilised, and that's certainly come up from our conversations with members. In relation to concerns and challenges with the bill, we have heard from member agents that as a first principle, building owners have the right to decide the use of their property as long as they are acting within the law restrictions from planning to building regulations and covenants. So I think we have been reminded that shouldn't be lost perhaps in the scrutiny process, and therefore there was a concern and an urge from members that there needs to be a greater understanding from policymakers in sort of three areas, and that's about economic viability of developing both small and large sites and buildings, the challenges, the costs of doing that, a slow planning process has come up time and time again from agents operating in Northern Ireland. One agent said it can take 6 weeks to get the architect, 2 months to submit the application, but it could be a year before they get approval. And one agent said, you know, he can think of a property in Bangor where they're operating, which has sort of been waiting 3 years in the planning system. So there's frustrations, obviously, with that. And finally, infrastructure backlogs linked to, you know, water and sewage connectivity. You know, we know the issue that's come up. So even when planning has been approved, that can still be a blockage. So individually or added together, these can also mean that sites are not attractive to investors, are left underdeveloped, and can lead to dilapidation. And additionally, local authorities must utilise the measures in the bill alongside local development plans in their areas, be able to identify property and land ownership, have adequate enforcement mechanisms, and councils, professionals and wider public have clear definitions. And we've kind of come up, believe, a rating system or categorisation to determine the status of a building and notice it may receive. So in terms of where we feel the bill could be strengthened, there's probably 5 key areas. As we've outlined in the written definition, I think inclusion of definitions of local detriment with categories and scales to create consistent enforcement across Northern Ireland. That could perhaps be under a new Schedule 3 under the definitions. Secondly, increase fines and the amount of fixed term penalty notice, as well as introduce a daily charge for non-payment to act as a greater deterrent and ensure the measures in the notice to remedy the condition of the building and ultimately land are adhered to. Thirdly, more focus on improvement. I think as we've put in the evidence, you know, there is an environmental cost and landfill cost to demolition. So we want to see that as a last resort. Almost there isn't a community use clause in the legislation linked to the assessment of buildings. So is there a reuse measure in there? Fourthly, focus on dangerous structures will need to include adjacent properties, which wasn't clear from our interpretation of the legislation, and an emergency action will need to be linked to neglect rather than a response to perhaps an incident, extreme weather or arson. I think that needs some further clarity. And finally, almost a sunset clause to review guidance regularly, and I think it would be valuable to have guidance produced for local authorities and professionals working in the sector as well. I think if we look at Scotland under their building regulations in the early 2000s, I think they had a procedural handbook which is quite detailed, so that could be a recommendation to take forward. And finally, as I said, the wider issues, the context is, I think, from these conversations with agents, to support successful implementation and ultimately improve the condition, safety and appearance of properties across Northern Ireland, there's probably 3 wider things which I don't think are in the direct competence or on the face of the bill, but perhaps could be included for further work, is, a review into the status of listed buildings and the current rules that allow them to receive business rates relief if vacant. I spoke to an agent in Downpatrick who said they're marketing a residential building and next door is almost identical, but the building's been split into office space. It was obviously bought cash buyer at auction, but if it's vacant, then there's 100% business rates relief on that. So what's the incentive to get that building occupied? Secondly, more broadly, a review into business rates. There is a concern from members that rates are too high and there's not enough incentives to support business to maintain property once occupied. So I think that's an element of if the legislation is the stick, could there be a carrot ahead of that to kind of improve things as well? And I think finally introducing a business rate system with improvement relief could also be utilised ahead of the application of maintenance notices as an incentive to ensure property is improved instead of only using or in partnership with these enforcement mechanisms. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It was a very, very detailed response that you've given us, and the papers is really, really good, actually. And certainly matches the detail that you've given now. So thank you very much, and I know there will be some questions for the members. There was one of the responses that you got. It's in regard to clause 19, which I've highlighted and underlined, which you've actually, and it jumped out because in terms of the language you've used is quite strong. So it says, additionally we disagree entirely that a fixed penalty should be used under 16.4 where people connected to the building can pay a £500 fine to discharge liability. And that sort of hints towards people maybe taking the fine and then obviously remaining anonymous and so on. I wonder, is there a suggestion that buildings potentially covered by this proposed legislation may already be used for criminal activity? Because I know that on your website, for instance, it indicates that there could be around £10 billion per year laundered through the UK Property Service, and that the evidence presented today hints that Northern Ireland either could become affected by that or may already be, which is possibly the case. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I think broadly. So the first point is, I think when we looked at the fixed penalty notice, that amount seems quite low. So we're not necessarily, we're in the territory of it's not it's not detrimental. And I think if it's low compared to the cost of improving or making the property safe, then potentially, people are going to look at that fine and then move on. So I think that was a concern. I think the wider issue is around, knowing property ownership is going to be really important to the application for local authorities. And I think, to some extent, welcoming the legislation, but the legislation is almost a framework, isn't it, for local authorities to operate. And I was just looking at, in England, they've introduced through the Levelling Up Act, the UK government, the high street rental auctions. But essentially there, local authorities are going to need to create a vacancy register and staff resource to run those auctions. And I just think it's going to be, there's still, even with these enforcement powers, there's still going to be an onus on local authorities to have that desire to understand the properties in their areas, create a vacant register, understand the ownership structures, and that's going to vary, I think, across the country.
Coming from that question, or coming from that point, then there's 2 points I'd just like to maybe, if we can extend out a little bit. This week we had an evidence session with our youth parliament here, and they were really good. And one of the issues that they picked out themselves was proof of ownership. Yeah. And what we're indicating here in this clause is that perhaps the level of fine that's being levied isn't enough. One, to people might be prepared to take the fine on the chin, but secondly, it doesn't help identify the owners. And what the young people were saying is, how do you actually, because that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, I suspect, with a derelict or vacant property, is establishing outright ownership, and that's really key to this. And I'll say this, that those who don't want to be named, or those who are perhaps involved in some other, using the property from some other reason, will take every avenue to avoid that, and certainly a small fine like that doesn't help the cause.
Yeah, so under I think the anti-money laundering legislation for property agents is UK-wide, and ultimately agents need to take two forms of ID on a basic level and understand property ownership. Over here, as I understand it, they will still do those checks, but there's a level through the conveyancing. So if they've checked with the solicitor and they've received confirmation from them on ownership, then that suffices. Obviously, if they can't find the ownership, or there's beneficial ownerships, or sometimes it can be easier to find if it's a company structure, because it'd be on company's house. If it's individuals, it cannot. But there are money laundering rules in place where certainly we do a lot of work educating agents across the UK that if you need a risk assessment to your business, if there is red flags, you need to be highlighting that to the National Crime Agency, HMRC, the suspicious activity reports. But ultimately, you know, there may need to be some investment from the department on the current registers, because ultimately over here, as I understand it, there was a move to digitalisation, but from talking to agents, there perhaps still some holes in that. So there needs to, I think, some investment. I mean, we even know from working in England and Wales, the land registry, there's a backlog on titles, there's even a backlog on new builds getting on there. So from an ownership point of view, that's a lot of agents will start with the title of the property. So if our registers aren't up to date, both commercial and residential, then yeah, there'll be gaps in the system. Which will...
A final one from me, and I hadn't thought of this angle, but you brought it up there. It was excellent because I hadn't thought of it. Genuinely, so I'm thinking of our carbon commitments. Okay.
Yes.
So in terms of the environmental aspect, whether we're looking at dilapidation, demolition, or rebuild, do you think that this legislation looks at that, considers it, and looks at, you know, the how we meet our carbon commitments, which are in legislation now? And is there a juxtaposition, or is there a rub here? And in terms of water quality and air quality and amenity too, do you think that the bill stacks up in that space, or is it something that needs to be assessed with that?
I'll come in, and I'm conscious I've talked to Stephen if you want to come in on anything. But I'll just comment on two on those. Well, I think, well, ultimately, well, there's 2 points there. I think we recognise as an organisation that I think across the UK up to 20% roughly of emissions are coming from buildings. So whether it's minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector, which is it's evolved and different governments are looking at, you know, we recognise there's a responsibility on building owners and the use and management to understand that and contribute to that, as long as, you know, targets are realistic and achievable. Certainly, I can't see any environmental impact assessment in the bill. Now, in England, lots of councils have passed climate change emergencies, so therefore you would expect them to almost have a climate clause in most of their policies. Whether that's the case in Northern Ireland, I don't know. So you're right. I think there probably isn't an environment.
There certainly is in planning.
Yeah.
Yes.
But this is circular, because part of this and part of the restructure, part of the making safe, part of the revitalisation. So this obviously it identifies the dilapidation, but requires action to change that. This probably kicks in quite significantly with the historic and listed buildings. I suspect is probably where the big rub is going to come here.
I think you look at historic buildings, but if you look at the building stock throughout Northern Ireland, we have a fairly high proportion of older, traditionally built properties.
Yep.
And we talk about trying to incentivise landlords or owners to improve their properties, to try and make the space better for everybody in terms of amenity, in terms of overall quality of our high streets. But the cost to that in itself is very prohibitive. Even getting it, if you imagine, I can think of one particular property. It's about 6,000 square feet. It's B1 listed. It's in the main city. Just to bring that property back to life, you're looking at £750,000. And I know the owner of the property, and there's absolutely no chance that he would ever have that money to enable him to carry that out. That's just one example of probably a wider spread of properties throughout Northern Ireland. And that's not even looking at where we are in terms of the ecosystem or otherwise. Then you're adding on plus on top of that to try and bring that building up to a standard that reflects where we are in climate change and everything else. So there are so many issues that we will face, especially here in Northern Ireland, especially based on the quality of buildings that we have, to be able to achieve that level. Even to achieve the level where we want buildings to be brought up to standard and in a lettable or saleable condition is going to be a problem. from my perspective, just looking at the bill, we were talking about a £500 fine or whatever the case may be, right? A lot of people are just going to look at that and go, that's a cost I'm prepared to pay. Strategically, there are lots of companies out there, and we talk about individuals that talk about companies who buy properties and just leave them sitting there, and quite prepared to leave them sitting there for 10, 15, 20 years. So to bring the thing together, it requires a lot more. A fine is the stick, but where is the carrot? And I understand that there's a limited pot of money in Northern Ireland, as there are throughout the United Kingdom. How do you address that problem? Because I don't think a fine in isolation is enough to prompt many people to improve their buildings. Certainly to spend significant sums of money, and I won't say this is across the board, but there are lots of people who are accidentally end up owning buildings and simply don't have the resources to bring them back to life.
It's a really difficult one. I think there's a carbon calculation for a building in a state of disrepair and dilapidation, and then there's a carbon budget calculation, for demolition or improving, and then there's the cost implications. It's complex.
Yes,
it really is. It's not straightforward. Declan and then John. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your briefing. It's been really helpful for us in trying to scrutinise this and deliberate on it. I can fully see the issue you flagged up there, whereby the fine would be much less than the prohibitive cost of repairing a building for some of these building owners. There's a couple of things that I want to just sort of tease out a wee bit. You mentioned the absence of a community use clause in the legislation. I just would be interested to find out from yourselves what do you think that would involve? What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I think we're thinking around that argument of restoration or reuse rather and almost demolition being the last port of call. And I just think that if we're probably looking at a staged process from local authorities, and that could perhaps be through the guidance that says, have they considered all these things? So has the environmental impact been sought? Have they a community use clause would be could it be refurbished, repurposed, and then engaged for the community, or are there community groups that need a space that it could be converted to? So there's sort of a more of a positive element to it. We have seen and I think certainly in England there are examples of that where groups have said we haven't had a community centre for years. Could that space has been empty? Can we convert it? Can we use it? So it was trying to sit alongside reuse and repurpose rather than demolish. If that makes sense.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. And Chair, just the last wee point then. It's just going back to that there situation. So if you have a situation where someone owns a holistic or traditional building that is way beyond their possibility of bringing it up to a safe standard, and they just can't afford to do that there. How do you think that can be resolved? Where it's virtually impossible because obviously that's what you don't want to do. Somebody who can't afford to maybe bring a building, or maybe their business is maybe is struggling in a building that's not up to speed. How can it be? And you mentioned something about the carrot and stick. What would be the carrot, for example?
Yeah. So, okay, let's take a listed building as an example. And from an economic perspective, it's absolutely pointless spending money on it because it just doesn't make any financial sense. And at the end of the day, if you're the owner of a property, the thing has to make good financial sense to be able to do something that's going to have a positive output. And I've no doubt that any of my friends in Heritage will probably lynch me now for saying this, but there are occasions where you have listed buildings that quite frankly will never be brought back into life. And there are a variety of reasons why it's not practical or financially viable to do so. And in those situations, and I'd be very careful how I say this, it may be that those properties need to be delisted and the property rebuilt in a more modern way and in a much more cost-effective way. And I'm not saying that anybody should take that as a blanket approach or that I'm suggesting it's a blanket approach, but there are instances where there are buildings in such conditions that it is just not practical to be able to bring them back into usable life in their current guise. That is not across the board, but there are instances where I can see that being a possibility.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. And John.
Chair, thank you, and thank you for your detailed submission to the committee also. I want to start, if I may, with just a couple of points of principle, and the first one being it's my own, that there's a do-nothing option, and where we are currently somewhere near that, frankly, because of the inconsistency involved. But the other one is, I think, responsibility. Now, we've heard conversation already about people who may have inherited something by accident of birth, for example, and we know that that happens. But I think they're the smaller number of examples that we could use, and I think the greater number are people who are involved in speculative business dealings, and therefore could well, and I'm not disputing the principle behind all of this because it's how commercial interests operate, but they could be in line to make significant sums of money when their site is developed or redeveloped, and therefore I'm becoming uncomfortable with talks of carrots in general, and I think we need to be very specific here. I'm also uncomfortable because as MLAs we will have dealt with many people over the past few years in particular who haven't been in a position to do much required repairs to their own domestic properties. And when you look at this proportionally, people on medium or low incomes who can't afford to fix the roof or replace their windows, or when they've suffered storm damage can't put it right. I mean, there are many examples of this. And individual ownership brings with it those responsibilities. Therefore, I'm asking, do you in principle agree that there should not be any general assumption that public money should be used to protect private interests in relation to dilapidation, especially where there's a speculative business concern that could ultimately make an individual significant sum, or a company significant sums of money?
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, but there's a fine balance in that. I mean, again, as an agent, I can see where I've seen rows of buildings being purchased and have sat for the last 15 or 20 years, and you have pigeons that have invaded them and creating the problems with that.
I know this.
And it's almost as if there is. It's almost as if it's a deliberate thing to do in order to achieve another goal, but we might not necessarily understand what that goal is at that time. I do believe that there is a need, absolutely, to have a level playing field, and I agree with what you've said in terms of there are larger commercial interests who, quite rightly, don't need to be rewarded for bringing buildings up to standard. If they've bought the building, then they obviously have a plan, and if they want to use it as a commercial venture, well then they invest their own commercial monies into such an arrangement. But it's finding the balance between that and where you do have those instances. And I can't talk about Northern Ireland in the whole, I can only talk about the area that I come from, that I do know from a personal experience, because I'm in that business. There are quite a few properties that are lying vacant simply because the owners do not have the funds to repair them, or alternatively, the other side of the coin is there is no commercial appetite for these commercial buildings or residential buildings, and therefore they don't want to put any more money into them, to lose money effectively, because there's no appetite for an uptake, whether that's leasing them or selling them. There is no perfect answer, in my humblest opinion. I do think that we absolutely need to put a process in place that encourages people to improve the stock that's out there, to make them more energy efficient. However, it's an impossibility to understand where every single person is at any particular moment in time. And sadly, like anything, there will be those who will potentially suffer under such an arrangement, and there will those who will profit under such an arrangement. I'm not suggesting that the carrot should be given out to everybody. I don't know what processes are in place, but there are certainly people out there who, if they had some form of rates relief, or there was some sort of grant aid available to them, that would improve our high streets, it would improve our building stock, and it would make Northern Ireland a better place to inhabit.
Yep, okay, look, but to just tease this one out a bit more, if you may, that principle could be applied, well, stricter principles, that could be applied to every single property across this jurisdiction, commercial, domestic, whether occupied or not. And I'm going to this next point because, you know, people perhaps most affected by this, if you count numbers of people, there may be one owner, whether that's corporate or individual, but the people living around many of these buildings will take a hit to their property values, their visual amenity, their residential amenity, and even very practical and real risks of people walking past where a roof might fall off. So there's an everyday loss, financial and otherwise, to those who inhabit the area around these places. And if you're going to start getting into conversation about public support, there's another argument about public purchase and taking something off someone, because it's a very different conversation altogether if you're going to use government money to put something right that's gone wrong in a situation where a business speculative arrangement could ultimately then make many millions of pounds out of it. I suspect the taxpayers would not be comfortable with that, and they know that I wouldn't be when we just look at the basics of it. So I think we need to bear all that in mind. There are other, if I can go into another question, there are other aspects of this which I'd like some more information on. I don't want to put you spot on this. This is something that could be developed, but you know, the conversation we're having and the presentation you've given us here shows there are many different interdepartmental responsibilities in relation to the matters we're talking about. The historic environmental record, for example, sits with communities. Rates obviously sits with finance. Planning sits in a mixture of infrastructure and local government. So can I ask, have you made representations before on this issue of dilapidation to those bodies where they have a role to play? Listed buildings has been a very good example of where they would have responsibility. And if you haven't already, and I understand that this may have been triggered by the dilapidation bill itself, is there a possibility that yourselves and other representative bodies could start speaking to these people in an interdepartmental way so that it helps all the pieces come together?
Yes. So I think I'll come to that point. I think when I agree everything that Stephen said, just on your first question, I think when we're talking about incentives, we're talking about, you know, we're obviously representing property agents, so we're talking about incentives for use. We want these buildings to be filled, whether that's community or a business or a startup. So when we're talking about incentives, it's about use. So maybe naively we're saying in an ideal world, every owner, every landlord wants to do that, and I understand the other side of the coin, there isn't. And if you don't have the safeguards within the incentives, things get exploited. But our basic premiership is use. We want vibrant communities. We know, as you said, that if there's curb appeal, there's property values, we want communities that aren't derelict. And there's even studies in the US where graffiti links to crime, you know, and that's been proven. So I think that's why before you even get to this bill, I think local authorities are going to need support, and which is what the chair alluded to, unless they've got the dedicated resource looking at property ownership in their area, and they've got a register of vacant properties and who owns it and or where do they need to go and find more information. They've not really got a starting point, and it's going to be very scattergun. The second point is, dare I say it, type of lease is going to need to be looked at, because you tend to get a full repair insuring lease versus an internal repairing lease. So if you're a landlord and you've issued a full repairing lease, then the onus predominantly is on the tenant, both internal and external, to repair and be in charge of the structure. They tend to be, for leases, longer, you're looking up to 20 years rather than the short term. But that could come into play. Now, we don't want to talk ourselves out of this legislation, but I do think that's a consideration that's come up with agents. That ownership, that lease structure is going to be an important starting point, I would say, for local authorities moving forward. But it goes into, and then it goes into that placemaking. Well, what's the local authority vision for their area? So if they know the ownership, they know that they've got a vision for use of properties, then I think they've got a strategy to target and use these mechanisms. But those things have got to be in place. And I think that feeds into your second point, second question. We do engage with the Department for Communities. We've worked a lot on the Private Tenancies Act reforms that have come through, and we do respond to the planning consultations and some of the energy efficiency consultations as well. And it all comes down to a strategy, doesn't it? What is the overall strategy for government, assembly, linking that through? So we would quite happily continue to work with other organisations, formally, informally, to pull that together. And we've probably done more work on empty homes. And I think there's potentially some policy tourism, as it were, to look at from empty homes residential in the commercial space. In Scotland, they have quite a successful empty homes partnership, but that's meant that 25 out of the 32 authorities in Scotland all have an empty homes officer. So there's a cost for that, but the Scottish Government have provided £2 million of investment at the most recent budget, and over 2,000 empty homes have been brought back into use. So I think, that's where we've probably looked at more on the empty home side, but we do think there should be a strategy, and happy to feed into that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thomas?
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned the listed buildings to start with. I'm very passionate about that, and it's all part of our built heritage, and I would like to see that, going forward, that everything is done to ensure that our listed buildings are preserved and brought up to standard again. But you talked about the challenges. What impact do you see the delays in planning application here and the inability of NIEA to respond to consultation process in a timely manner will have on the outworkings of this bill?
I mean, I think probably all could agree that the planning processes in Northern Ireland are quite difficult, and people make applications that can sit in a system for 3 or 4 years. There seems to be, and this is my own personal opinion, no particular will to change or improve that. I can only speak from my own experiences based on the Northwest. But if you're in a position where you have a listed building and you want to bring that back into life, the hoops that you have to jump through are just, they're unquantifiable at times. And there's a sort of a game of ping pong, quite frankly, going backwards and forwards just between different statutory bodies, trying to get answers. There are questions raised, they go back, there are more questions raised. And I think we have to find a solution whereby, and I know a lot of authorities would want this across the UK, where we can streamline the system and make it much more efficient. But it is a difficulty, because if you can sit and imagine pre-COVID, the cost of construction was a lot less than it is today. You hold a planning application up 2 years, 3 years. So you start off with a plan and you're working off your matrix of costs. By the time you get your planning permission, those costs have risen exponentially. And therefore, what was a viable option at day 1, year 3 is no longer a viable option. So there is no doubt in my mind that the planning processes in Northern Ireland need to be addressed, need to improve, and it needs to be much more streamlined.
And this could be part of the reason that we have such or so many of these disused buildings sitting in our towns, our villages and our rural areas, is simply back down to the delays that there is in the planning system, and some people who have been looking for the planning then turn around and they walk away from it because, as you say, after a couple of years or more in the system, the cost has escalated so much.
Yeah, well, I think I spoke to an agent working out of Belfast, and they said, well, they just said from the planning, and we know local councils are under pressure, and it's easy to point the finger at local authorities, and that's not what we want to do. But they had certainly a frustration that the councils miss deadlines on planning, and there's no consequence. It just rumbles on, and they just said there's no consequence to that. So that's a frustration. And the only thing I would add, going back to the bill, certainly on we were struggling to see the timeframes for issuing the notices. So what's the time frame from first assessment from a local authority, and then, or how long has a property been vacant, damaged? So you've got the hierarchy of the notices, but no staged process of the timelines of assessment. Yeah. So a local authority might visit it in week 1. Are they waiting 6 months, 6 weeks, 12 months before they issue the notice, or not? So I think that plays into the timescales for both planning and the notices in order to get things moving.
Yeah, so I mean, if councils are going to be responsible for issuing the notices, then they also need to be responsible for freeing up the planning process to allow the thing to move forward. So council does have a bit of work to do then.
Yes, we've heard that from member agents in Northern Ireland, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Daniel?
Yeah, just to follow on from the carrot and stick comments, the carrot really should be in access to services to enable redevelopment, and there's just too much stick when it comes to getting things through the planning process, particularly through local government and councils. It becomes a point of great frustration to the extent that people have started to give up really in doing it. But this whole thing, it's going to be very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all solution to the multifaceted problem, because there's such a combination of and a diverse range of circumstances at play. So you do have the big fish, those who come along, own plenty, spend even less, and they do exist in all of our towns. I'm conscious of a number of them, and they come along with the long-term goal of maybe selling it off to a public body in the future for the regeneration of town centres. It's happening, unfortunately, and as a result we have this land banking happening and holding up development and hindering the cosmetic view of the area. But equally we do have a situation where people just cannot afford it, so the ordinary town trader who is in a 3-storey building and the roof's falling in on top of them, just about making ends meet. Those are the genuine cases, the people that are doing the hard slog on a daily basis and genuinely cannot afford to do the regeneration work. And in between that, you also have very large organisations such as Royal Mail, and I've had a recent very direct argument with them about the state of a listed building in Strabane, which they've resided in for generations. And luckily now they've responded to the concerns raised, because they were unfortunately embarrassed into doing so. And equally you have public bodies. Not all of our public buildings are up to standard and don't set a positive example in much of our town centres. So this is very, very complex, and the concern I do have at the heart of it is I'm aware of a number of streets where there is dereliction in West Tyrone, just to be localised about this, and there's young sparky developers wanting to do something with it. They get into the planning system and move nowhere. They're hit with big bills to provide consultations on NA water for the wastewater network, which is, just as we know, a disgrace. So there's all sorts of issues. So my question is, if you two were 21, you aren't far off it, but if you two were 21 and you were buying a building in Strabane or Omagh and you want to turn 2 old houses into 4 or 5 apartments, you're hit back at the first hurdle basically, and you're told, well, you're not going to get this because there's no wastewater infrastructure. But if they already own the building and they're submitting that application and they're stopped because of the lack of investment in those structures that should be provided by government, should those people be fined in the same way? So this is why this is complex, and people are going to fall victim to the system. It's going to disincentivise investment. And I'm worried about that. We do have an issue with dereliction, but it's not the small man or woman that is the cause. It's the big fish, the beasts with the money that can afford for things to sit there. And I think there needs to be a more forensic insight into who those individuals are. If they have a substantial portfolio and 10 companies that own half the country, those are the guys that need slapped hard with the fines.
Well, okay, so let me give you an example of a scenario that I'm aware of. And I'm going to use the word land assembly. And what I mean by that is that there is a developer comes to mind who is picking up properties in a particular area of a particular city. And those properties are sitting rotting around their ankles. There's all sorts of problems that come out. And their strategy is that they will try and buy the next building to the next building to the next building to the next building with no intentions of doing anything to them until they've acquired a critical mass, and then they'll put an application in, quite frankly, probably to demolish everything and build a superstructure of some description. Okay, so I understand exactly what you're alluding to. On the flip side, I also remember that 21-year-old, although my brain is now fading. And you're absolutely right. There are people who have a drive, a get up and go, who are looking to do something positive to make their communities better. Don't get me wrong, they're also looking to make a commercial business out of it. And they are being stymied. And it is a really, really difficult matrix to be able just to go, this person here, that person there. It's an impossibility. I can go back to at a day and time when properties in Londonderry were sitting in states of disrepair, and the housing executive used to give grants to bring them back to life. And the deal was simply this: you got your grant, you renovated your house, you brought it back into livable, habitable standards. If you sold it within a 3 or 5 year period, then you paid that money back. So the carrot was the grant. And the stick was, if you sold it, we wanted our money back. And I thought that model was clean and simple and easy to understand and had an effective positivity on the communities that availed the service. Now, I know we're talking about residential, we're talking about commercial, we could even be talking about sites that are with Japanese knotweed. There's such an array of individual properties out there. It's an impossibility even now to sit down and try and just figure out what's what. But sometimes people need to be jolted into action. Sometimes there are larger companies who, quite frankly, can challenge these things. Give them a £500 fine. It's not going to be an issue. It's whether or not, as we talked about, how to categorise things and in what stages you put them in, and what fine or action do you take commensurate with your understanding of the property ownership or whatever the case may be. And that's where there's a lot more work to be done to try and understand that and to try and put it into some kind of matrix where we can look at it and apply common sense approaches to each type, in my view.
Given all the hurdles, just to supplement what you've said, is there a risk that we disincentivise those investors, regardless of age, background or other, but the ordinary man or woman trying to make a difference, going out on their own, taking a risk? Is there a potential risk that we, by these sorts of fines sitting when the system is so choked with problems, is there a risk that we disincentivise those or put them off from a potential investment, and ultimately, by default, as a consequence, the larger beast basically gobbles up the opportunities because they can afford to do so?
Well,
because it would put me off.
Okay, but if you're in that commercial world, there's also an element of risk in everything you do, and I do understand.
I'm a company director, by the way, Chair. I should say that, but I don't buy up and sell property.
Okay, so there's a commercial
No.
commercial risk to everything that people do. And if if you've got a young enterprising person who's coming along, they will make their decisions based on where they see the commercial viability of it is. But I accept what you're saying is they may also be very aware and have cognizance of the fact the planning system's slow, the water infrastructure system's creaking, if not broken completely.
Well, I think it also comes down to what's the local authority strategy to the enforcement, and how are they going to use these powers. So are they open to a conversation with the owners and about use, or is it, we're not open, we've got these powers, here's your maintenance notice, you need to sort it. So I think it's about understanding, are they willing to work with people to say, you know, are you looking, you know, as the owner, are you looking to do anything with this? If not, then clearly there's an enforcement mechanism in place. But if you are, what's that process? How can government support that?
Most people would answer that with yes, I want to do something with them.
Well, then they've got to ask for, well, what's the business plan? And
then it just comes back to, we can't get planning, we can't get access to the
Oh,
wastewater.
potentially. Yeah,
I'm just saying it's
potentially,
been round. You can see where the problem is here, and a lot of it sits in this building in terms of solutions that could unravel some of these hurdles. But there is a challenge here, and it would really test the effectiveness of this bill, but absolutely it would have, in my opinion, a disproportionate impact on the small man or woman in business that's trying to carry forth an investment.
And I think we can see some sympathy with that argument, and I think that's where we toy with the business rates argument. Is that a red herring or not? But ultimately, the more we speak to agents, it goes back to use. You know, there's no business rates relief for new businesses entering premises for the first 12 months. There's no business rates relief if you improve your premises. So that's when we're talking about carrots. Mm-hmm. We're talking about good people, good businesses, that small man and woman you're talking about entering a premises. Well, what's the help for them in order to fill our high street? So I think it's the other side of the coin. Or ultimately, the Assembly's got to decide, is it use it or lose it? Through the high street rental auctions in England, basically the process is, if a commercial premises, a shop, has been empty for at least a year or a year and a day, 366 days in a 24-month period, the local authority, if they've set an empty shop register, they have a boundary area, a bit like a public space protection order, and they've done a public consultation, they've got the legal authority to auction that property off. And the landlord's consent's not needed. So it's use it or lose it, isn't it? How strong do you want to go in terms of enforcing ownership? What we're trying to say is that there's an enforcement mechanism through this legislation, but there's probably a step before where local authorities have got to understand their areas, you've got to bring in owners, you've got to understand the leases, you've got to understand the economic viability planning, and then you might not even need a maintenance notice because people go, oh, there's relief here, there's incentive here, I can get into this property, and we get the vibrant communities we want. So I think it's two sides.
There's many steps, Chair, thanks for your indulgence, but there's many steps to be taken for that ever be a consideration, I would assume, for such a harsh penalty, although I could see the reasoning for it in some instances. But if it's actually the public system that's preventing the investment, then it's difficult
it
to
is
put in.
part of it, I think. I think that's part of it. I think the other thing to be wary of is that it doesn't become something that becomes punitive, and it has to have substance, and there has to be, as we've already alluded to, you have to have grade, you have to understand the reasons why as well. This is then when you get into the minutiae of everything. I think there are certainly people out there who are hoarding property for strategic reasons. Yeah. There are people who are genuine cases where they own a property and they simply cannot afford to bring it back into life and to improve it. And then there's somewhere in the middle ground as well. So, you know, I don't think we'll have all the answers and all the solutions here today.
Just outlining how complex it is.
Yeah. We agree. We agree.
Thank you guys. Just for the record, Daniel, you got using William's Aunt Michelle's time there. So you did it. But it was really good. It was really good because I think what it highlights is the crossover here with the Department of Communities, the Communities Committee for ourselves, because these powers are going to rest and reside with the local councils in the first point, but also the revitalisation schemes. And just on Daniel's point, I'm just going to close with this one, guys, if you don't mind, is Daniel's absolutely quite right, except the neighbours of derelict properties lose amenity and lose value. So I don't think it's as simple as to say the point that you rest because you can't afford. There is a decision to be made in use it or do, either use it or not lose it. I'm not going to suggest that at all, but a system of repurposing the property and then a mechanism to do that. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. Really do appreciate it. I'm sure we may well be in touch again because it was a very useful session.
Great.
Thank you, members. Thank you. Okay, members. Thank you. Now, agenda item 7 is our next item. It is a departmental oral evidence session. The SL1, the Waste Fees and Charges Amendment Number 2 Regulations, Northern Ireland 2025. I refer you to the SL1, the draft SR and the explanatory memorandum, starting at page 38 of the pack. The Department intends to make this SR under the draft affirmative procedure, bring into effect the annual uplift to the Northern Ireland Environmental Agency NIEA waste charging scheme for 25-26. I now I'm going to welcome the following officials to the meeting and invite them to provide their evidence to the committee. We will see Mr. Colin Breen, the Assistant Director of Environmental Resource Policy Division, ERPD. We will have Mrs. Carmel McDowell, Acting Head of Branch Waste Legislation at DAERA, Mr. Mark Cherry, Head of Waste Regulations Unit NIEA, and Mr. Philip Walker, the Deputy Head of Financial Planning at NIEA. So. Already name checked you guys just before you come in, so just take your time and just get yourself settled, and then when you're ready to go, just feel free to brief the committee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to come here today and provide you with a briefing on the Waste Fees and Charges Amendment Number 2 Regulations, Northern Ireland 2025. The Northern Ireland Environment Agency, hereafter referred to as NIEA, operate an annual charging policy for the regulatory activities. The charging policy covers 8 separate charging schemes, of which the Waste Management Charging Scheme is one. The Waste Management Charging Scheme requires legislation to be laid to make it operational. The NIEA charging policy is governed by the principles of managing public money Northern Ireland and operates under a full cost recovery model. This means that the NIEA charges operators of regulated activities the full cost of those regulatory activities, and that they're not subsidised by the taxpayer. The fees and charges covered by the charging policy are uplifted annually. They're normally uplifted by the GDP deflator figure issued by Treasury in December each year. However, the charging policy allows the Department to apply any other mechanism as deemed appropriate to ensure the maintenance of full cost recovery, thus preventing any potential departmental losses. After analysis by the NIA Finance Branch, it was agreed that the fees and charges for 25-26 should be uplifted by 6.19%. The uplift applies to the schemes in the Waste Management Charging Scheme 2025. Had NIA used the 25-26 GDP deflator figure of 2.39% as issued by Treasury, the agency would have lost an estimated $750,000 in fees and charges across all the schemes, and this would have had to be paid by the public purse. Normally, the statutory rule required to bring the Waste Management Charging Scheme into operation each year is led by negative resolution. However, these regulations are made under Schedule 4 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, which stipulates that those regulations will be subject to the draft affirmative resolution procedure unless they are only altering a fee or charge to reflect changes in the value of money. Therefore, because the fees and charges are being uplifted by a figure that is not a standard inflationary measure, the Waste Fees and Charges Amendment Number 2 Regulations Northern Ireland 2025 are required to be laid by draft affirmative resolution. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer where possible.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And when you look at the bill, the changes, the percentage uplift, it sounds and looks pretty reasonable, and there's obviously very good reasons for doing it because it's cost recovery, not profit making. And just to set the scene a bit clearer here, whilst the uplift seems pretty reasonable, you pointed out that without doing that, it would be a £750,000 loss. Could you set us out a wee bit more of a picture in terms of the waste management, the level of waste management in terms of those carriers and companies who do it, what that amounts to for those people, and is it envisaged that it will be in any way a burden for those operators and companies?
Well, what I can say is that I can go through some of the fees that some operators are going to get. So, for example, 71 operators in 24 to 25 paid £338. They'll pay £359 this year, which is an increase of £21. 35 paid, for example, £3,218 in 24-25. They'll pay £3,417, 25-26, which is an increase of £199. The highest in 24-25 was £10,297. This will go up to £10,934, which is an increase of £637 for 25-26. Now, I know that NIA operate a debt policy, so maybe could you talk a wee bit about that?
Well, in terms of debt, obviously invoices are raised and operators have 30 days to pay. Now, sometimes operators fall outside that payment regime, and where there are hardship, we do try and facilitate a payment plan or late payment in those cases. It's certainly not a case of we'd want to be draconian in terms of trying to push operators over the edge. So there is a facility there where we can, where operators can apply for hardship, and we do ease the conditions in those cases.
Okay, and in terms of that higher figure there with the uplift to 637, is that just is that a one operator in that space?
It's
just one operator. That's
yeah.
fine. I had kind of hoped that was the case. Okay. Final question from me. The briefing paper states that a specific consultation was not considered necessary as the increase in fees and charges is in line with the charging policy that NIEA already have previously consulted on, and no issues were raised at previous committee meetings. But the increase calculated GDP deflator figure, which is for the current year, is 2.39%, as the proposed increase is now significantly higher at 6.19%. Can you explain that a wee bit better? Or did it not warrant further consideration?
Well, the policy itself asks us to use the GDP deflator. Now, we are reserved the right to use, where the GDP deflator does not recover full cost, we can move on to an alternative method. The most suitable alternative method for calculating was actual cost, because the overwhelming majority of our cost increase is staff related, and that's where the 6.19% comes from. In the past, GDP deflator served us very well, simply because pay increases applied to the civil service have been quite modest. So GDP deflator has been in the region of 1.5, 2.5% over the last number of years. Pay increases in the civil service, or the increase in cost in salaries in the civil service, has been around that sort of range. So it has served us very well. It's only in the last couple of years where there's been this issue of slightly better pay increases for civil servants. That's pushed the salary cost up, and as a result pushed the regulatory cost up. Yeah. And
staff fees is percentage wise the vast. Is that the bulk of the cost?
On average, on a £130 bill, roughly £100 of that would be what I call direct staff costs. So those would be the cost of the staff directly involved in those regulatory activities. That additional £30 would relate to overheads. So that'll be things like accommodation, even depreciation on vehicles which are used, inspecting sites, corporate services overhead in terms of services provided by the parent department, and also third-party providers like IT Assist, HR Connect, and Account NI. So roughly £100 of that 130 is direct staff costs.
Okay, no problem. You're very popular. Went in to see you. Okay, that's my two questions then. Any further questions, Declan?
Chair, thank you for your presentation there. I suppose one of the things you'd mentioned about operators can apply for hardship, but it got me thinking there, is there a possibility that these increased fees could have a negative impact on, say, small scale or community led waste recycling initiatives? Or is there any particular supports or exemptions available for that?
Small scale or charity.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any at the minute, Declan, and I'm not too sure about how there's any impact on that, so I couldn't give you a direct answer on that.
Yeah. And I suppose, is there a possibility, that the fees could maybe discourage some, or have a negative impact of compliance amongst some of the smaller operators? Has that be considered?
It's only my personal opinion. The fee increased this year, albeit 6%, and some of the scaling across some of those invoices, some of the smaller fees around £300 or £400. To be honest, the 6% is not much of an increase, really. Certainly for the bigger operators, that figure was quoted there at around £10,000. The fee increase could be quite substantial, but those operators would be significant operators within the waste industry and the waste sector themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just if there was, because you'd mentioned about the hardship maybe got me thinking. So it's just something you maybe come back on in terms of there's a charity or community-led initiatives, if that would have any impact on them, or if there are any exemptions for them, or any.
I don't have figures in front of me, but obviously me on the regulation side of the house, we issue the invoices. We haven't had any real feedback on the negative side in terms of the increases. Certainly last year, this year has yet to go out, but for last year, no, we haven't had any sort of negative feedback on that front. And our debt recovery is quite modest, quite low in that area, so we haven't seen an increase in debt recovery either for that period.
Thank you very much.
It's quite obvious that the cost recovery for you guys is going to be passed on to those who are seeking the services of the waste operators too. I've just got one final one, if it's okay, and it's in regard to the fact that no equality impact was felt needed to be done in this instance. Will it be revisited in future, or is it assessed that it will only equality impact will maybe only be used in terms of if there's operational changes, or rather than around the costs?
Is the scheme going to be reviewed?
I think whenever the next, our current regulatory fees and charges policy is due for renewal fairly shortly. I don't have an exact date for that, but I think at the next review stage of that would be a useful opportunity to undertake that. Definitely.
Okay. Members, any further questions?
No.
For the witnesses? No. Thank you very much. Can't promise you'll get off as late the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, members. Thank you. Okay, members. The procedure, as I've already indicated, is draft affirmative. There will be a debate in plenary. Are you content that the committee supports the SR as drafted in the debate? Thank you, members. Appreciate it. Okay. Agenda item 8 is the Departmental Oral Evidence Session on Air Quality Common Framework. I refer you to the pack starting at page 49 for the briefing paper provided an update on the framework and outlines the next steps. A copy of the Provisional Framework Outline Agreement starts at page 54 of your pack. Members, we previously received a written briefing in September last year, and this oral briefing today continues our scrutiny of this common framework, for which DAERA is the lead department. Members, I'm now going to welcome the following officials to the meeting and invite them to brief the committee. We have Miss Amy Holmes, Head of Air and Environmental Quality Branch, Miss Caroline Barry, Head of Chemical and Industrial Pollution Policy Branch, and Miss Kate Fitzsimmons, Policy Advisor, Air and Environmental Quality Branch. My apologies to you, Sarah, for reading so quickly. Hopefully you're sitting beside the right name. Just take your time and get yourself set up, and then we'll take the briefing. Okay, I've introduced what the topic is, so if you're ready to give us the briefing, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to brief you this morning on the UK-wide Provisional Common Framework on Air Quality. I'll refer to it as the Air Quality Common Framework, and the purpose of our meeting this morning is to assist you in scrutinising the Common Framework. My name is Amy Holmes. I'm Head of Air and Environmental Quality, and I'm joined by Kate Fitzsimmons in our team. She's an Environmental Policy Advisor who's been leading on the framework. And also with me this morning is Caroline Barry, who's Head of the Industrials and Chemicals Policy Pollution team. This is one of 15 DAERA Common Frameworks, and it was published for scrutiny in February 2022, and scrutiny is part of the UK Common Framework's 5-phase development programme. So as I said, it was laid in Parliament in February 2022 and published as a command paper. The framework itself is essentially a non-legislative mechanism that outlines how the UK government and the DAs will work together on air quality policy following the UK's exit from the EU. The scope of the framework is UK-wide. So the framework is intended to promote multilateral policy development, and it sets out proposed high-level commitments for the UK government and the devolved administrations as regards collateral partnership and policy making. Essentially, it's a tool for policy development. The framework has 2 sections. The first is the Provisional Framework Outline Agreement, and the second is the Concordat, and the documentation, I understand, is included in your briefing pack. The legislation that's included in the framework aims to reduce harmful emissions and concentrations of air pollutants in ambient air that can damage human health and the environment. So turning to the framework itself, the legislation that's covered includes assimilated EU law, which was previously referred to as retained EU law or rule, alongside devolved policies and policies that are reserved to Westminster. So the assimilated EU law that's falling within the framework is the Ambient Air Quality Directive and Fourth Order Directive, the National Emissions Ceiling Directive, parts of the Industrial Emissions Directive, the Medium Combustion Plants Directive, the regulation on the establishment of an EU pollutant release and transfer register, the directive on the sulphur content of certain liquid fuels, and the Control of Volatile Organic Compounds Directive, and also the directive on petrol vapour recovery during refuelling of motor vehicles at service stations. Other legislation covered by the framework relates to international commitments, and these are commitments that stem from the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, the Protocol on the Pollutant Release and Transfer Registers, the United Nations Kiev Protocol, and the Aarhus Convention, which relates to public participation in decision-making. The Northern Ireland Executive previously consented to UK-wide statutory instruments being made under the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 in preparation for a no-deal exit, and this was done in 2019. So these SIs were approved by both houses in the UK Parliament, but the commencement date was deferred by the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020 until the end of the transition period. Due to the absence of an executive at the time of laying, these SIs were noted without prejudice to the views of returning NI executive ministers. And this legislation sets out relevant statutory powers of the governments within the UK, and these SIs have been amended to take account of the withdrawal agreement. The Northern Ireland Protocol is referenced within the air quality framework, as this was the protocol in place when the framework was published for scrutiny in 2022. However, this has now been superseded by the Windsor Framework, so the framework will be revised to reflect the requirements of the Windsor Framework, and the standard text for that has now been agreed. Due to Annex 4 of the Windsor Framework, Northern Ireland remains aligned with the EU Industrial Emissions Directive post-Brexit, in respect of installations that produce electricity that feed into the single energy market on the island of Ireland. The second part of the framework document is made up of the Concordat, and this provides a non-legislative mechanism which sets out the scope of the framework and the principles for engagement. This includes establishing decision-making and a dispute resolution process, and this is primarily to manage the issue of any potential divergence. The Concordat also establishes a review and amendment mechanism for future updates to the framework, and it's envisaged that any updates or reviews would be initiated by DAERA. Reviews are due to take place every 3 years. No reviews have taken place to date since it was published in 2022. The guiding principle for decision making is that all parties aim to reach a consensus and that decisions will be made in line with the UK's existing international obligations. Turning now to the governance structure of the framework. The framework encompasses both the air quality and the best available techniques framework, and they both share the same UK air quality governance group, which is the senior level group. So at the top of the structure, we have the portfolio ministers and the interministerial group. Then we have the senior officials programme board, the UK air quality governance group. And beneath that, we have a series of subgroups, some focusing more on ambient air quality, such as the Common Framework Working Group, and certain air quality subgroups. And then on the BAT side, which is best available techniques, we have the BAT Standards Council and BAT policy subgroups, which relate primarily to small and medium industries. These groups hold discussions on the policy and evidence requirements of the legislation that are included in the framework, and the DAs are represented in all of these groups. These groups provide advice to the Air Quality Common Framework Working Group and, where appropriate, to the governance group and ministers on the rationale and the approach taken within a policy area. So thinking about the current stage and where we are in this framework, on the 7th of October, TEO Private Office have confirmed that the First and Deputy First Minister have jointly agreed the latest version of the Windsor Framework text. The framework has been undergoing parliamentary scrutiny in all 4 parts of the UK, and this is yet to be undertaken for NI, which is what we're doing this morning. So once this committee has considered the Provisional Common Framework, officials across the UK will then consider collectively the feedback that has been received and make changes as required. So in terms of the role of the committee today, recognising that some of the drafting does need updating due to the passage of time since publication in 2022, the committee is invited to consider the framework, the briefing paper, and what we said this morning, and provide officials with comments, and we will then feed this back to DAERA, and at that stage scrutiny will be complete. So thank you very much for your time, and Kate, Caroline and I are very happy to answer questions and assist further.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation today, and for the papers that were submitted that are in the members' packs. Just a very quick question at the start, and then I've got 2 subsequent ones. I think you'd indicated that there has been no review so far since it was first brought together. Is there a date when the first review is anticipated?
We don't have a date as yet, but the finalisation process of the framework that we're going through at the minute will lead to lots of sort of drafting checks, etc. of the document. So once it's finalised, then it'll be in place, and the reviews are open really then beyond that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. Do you know to what extent the framework allows for regional flexibility, and are there any specific policy areas that DAERA have sought divergence on, or Northern Irish specific mitigations or changes?
There's good room for flexibility on regional air quality issues. So because we could potentially have different pollutants in Northern Ireland or different sources for those pollutants, that gives us the flexibility here to make sure we are dealing with those, and that could ultimately lead to some divergence, but through the governance groups we and the various groups we sit on, we're all closely aligned really on the science used to make any decisions. So it should minimise divergence, but it is possible.
It is possible?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No problem. And has DAERA identified any of those areas at this point?
At this point, there's not at this point, no.
Okay, thank you. I understand that although a periodic review of the framework will take place every 3 years, and you've pointed out when that is likely to happen when it's brought together, an exceptional review of the framework is triggered by a significant issue. Is DAERA aware, or can they give any examples of what might be a significant issue, or what might trigger then an earlier review then once we've put the thing together?
It's not something that's come up in discussions, but if you'd like, we're happy to discuss that with DEFRA and come back to the committee if that would be helpful.
I think that would be useful. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, members, I've exhausted my questions. Declan and then Daniel.
Yeah, just briefly, you had mentioned there yourselves that the framework must comply with the Windsor Agreement, and indeed you mentioned Annex 4 as well. So bear in mind that Windsor Agreement recognises the EU and the all-island dimension, and we know that AIR doesn't recognise borders. So what level of engagement have you been having with your counterparts in the south of Ireland around this issue?
Around the framework specifically?
Yeah.
We have really good engagement with colleagues in the south, both within the department and their EPA, on wider air quality issues. They are aware of the UK quality framework. They're not a party to it, so we haven't had direct discussions about the framework, but in terms of wider air quality policy and research, there's been very good engagement, and you may have been made aware of the recent award of the Peace Plus cross-border contact. That's 6.5 million across both jurisdictions, looking at air quality pollutants, in particular PM2.5, agricultural sources, transport, and residential solid fuel. So in general, the working relationship between us and colleagues in the south is very positive.
Thank you. And just very briefly, so just say for some reason if there is any divergence or tension between the framework and the Windsor Agreement, how do they be resolved?
This one, Karen. Thank you.
Because we do have a dispute resolution mechanism built into the common framework, any issues that we would have in relation to that could be escalated through that mechanism, as Amy has set out through, and It's escalated through the Air Quality Governance Group, and then up to senior officials and the Senior Officials Programme Board, and through the interministerial group. Yeah. So there is mechanisms there to address any issues that might come up because of that, because of divergence.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Declan and young Daniel.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to the three of you for your presentation. Just a number of things. So in terms of data collection, so am I right in saying it's down to individual councils to monitor that, or how does that operate?
In Northern Ireland, air quality data is air quality monitoring is the responsibility of the local councils. So DAERA, we write the policy, and we also ensure there is a local air quality management grant that goes out to assist the councils for the assessment, monitoring and review of air quality. So that could be everything from getting monitors in place in different regions for different pollutants. Then they would capture the data. It goes back to ourselves, to our website, which is publicly available. And then the data is collated annually and reported on both individually by the local councils annually, and then a Northern Ireland annual report, which also feeds into a UK-wide report.
And are any of the 11 councils not monitoring the air quality in the council area?
All councils are monitoring air quality. Some have different approaches. So the local air quality management regime is a UK-wide structure. There's a guidance note on how they should go about it, and it's up to the councils to identify different problems within their area. So they can then monitor in a way that they see suitable. So for example, you could put out passive monitoring, which is like a small diffusion tube that you would expose for a length of time. It'll get sealed and sent back to a laboratory and analysed for pollutants such as nitrogen dioxide. Or another approach is automated monitoring, which often is in place more long term. And it's quite highly technical, high-grade scientific equipment, and it requires calibration and lots of technical support to make sure it's accurate.
And out of the automated option, are all 11 councils using that?
10 out of the 11 councils are using the automated approach, and there's one district council.
In Strabane?
Derry, Strabane District Council actually have quite a lot of automated monitoring. They would be second to Belfast. They have a central monitor in Rosemount in Derry. They have Deal's Corner for nitrogen dioxide. They have 2 particulate matter monitors. One, in fact, they've got a few more actually. They've 2 specific particulate matter monitors in Strabane would be one, and Newton Stewart's another.
Which is the council without?
Without is Mid-Ulster. It depends on passive monitoring. So that's how they approach it. They actually have a couple of air quality management areas in place. So they have identified some areas that require a little additional assistance just through that system.
That's very helpful. And out of the 11 councils, which of the councils ranks in the top 3 in terms of the worst reading for air quality?
I don't actually have that data at hand. The data is very nuanced, so it would be easy to pull that out from the records, but it wouldn't be something I have to hand.
We could, if you'd like, come back to you with an annual average for each monitoring station, or for example, if you're asking about ratings, are you thinking the number of times we've seen a high? All of the automated readings go back onto the air quality website. You may have seen that. It's the map of Northern Ireland with the different dots on it, and then there is an index, an indice 1 to 10, so you can see, and it's live data, should be no more than an hour or 2 old, what the levels are. So if you're asking about annual averages, or if you're asking about the numbers of times we see a high, or if you're asking about the number of times that there has been a spike above what the allowable daily limit is, we can answer that question a variety of ways. So very happy to come back to you with further
We'll take all of that information. If it could be provided to the committee, it would be very helpful. I just have complaints via my office. I'm a West Tyrone MLA, and there is serious concerns about air quality in West Tyrone, but particularly so in the Derry Strabane side of the constituency. And I do have a number of questions, and indeed I've raised them in relation to that, so it would be very, very helpful. And just a final question, Chair. In terms of enforcement, those powers lie with local councils as well. Is that right?
The enforcement isn't enforcement as such. It is the local air quality management regime, which is where they identify an issue. They then designate an air quality management area, and that kicks in a requirement for the council to work collectively with other relevant authorities to put in place an action plan. And we work closely with the councils on that. Other departments with responsibility, perhaps DFI in relation to transport, or DFE and energy, can all feed into that action plan. And the way the regime is designed, then after a period of time, if the action plan has worked, the levels of pollutants should come down, and the air quality management area can then be revoked.
So who determines where that action plan should be put in place?
The council.
Yeah, so that's back to my point. So the council, it's down to the council to take an action if a level of complaint is raised, say in a village, and I'll go with West Tyrone, and the air quality has been disturbed in that particular village on a frequent basis. So we've had issues, and we've discussed it at this committee as well in the short time I've been on it, Chair, where individuals or businesses are burning materials or chemicals or whatever, and really badly, adversely affecting the air quality in a particular village. But every time I raise it with the council, this is happening on a Sunday. So by the time the council get out, there's no measurement of it, and this has went on and on and on and on. And I've asked the council to take an action, and they'll not do anything about it. So I'm asking where the teeth is in order to ensure people have equality in terms of the quality of their air.
Of course, the local air quality management regime kicks in when there is monitored evidence that it is above a certain level, and we don't have a monitor on every street across Northern Ireland. What the council may be thinking of is that's more of a statutory nuisance type issue, because it is only happening once a week. But certainly we are very happy when we write back to the committee on details of
that'd be very helpful. And
levels
this is
of
very
Northern
brief.
Ireland.
Very brief. This is very brief. But in terms of the monitors, where they're located, is that at the discretion of the council?
There's a number of pieces of legislation at play. Some of it stems from the Clean Air for Europe directive. And we have the automated network, which is overseen by DAERA. And that's part of the network. There's also some discretion within the district councils to pick where they want monitors because they see separate need, and we fund the councils for those. We also work closely with the councils and provide input and feedback as to, because we have oversight of all of Northern Ireland and what all the councils are doing, so we can give guidance or opinions, but it's largely due to the council's local knowledge.
So no, I'll be interested in the information, but it's very brief, Chair, and this is an important point. If the councils have discretion as to the location, no council wants the reputation for having the worst air quality in Northern Ireland. So is it advantageous to the council to locate them in certain locations that wouldn't pick up a reading that would be negative to the reputation of the council?
We understand what your
that's
point,
happening. My opinion.
Thank you.
That's useful.
Can I go back just, Amy, just for the clerk, needs some information on one of the questions that you answered there to Daniel, was in regard to the data sets that you would be, so I think we got 2 of them, but could you tell us what the data sets are that will be available to share with the committee then?
All the data is on the website. Okay. I think what Ms McCrossen was suggesting was maybe annual average data for certain key pollutants. We could do nitrogen dioxide and PM2.5. If the committee would like further pollutants, we can draw out that data. Equally, I suggested maybe it's every time where there is a reading on the daily indice of 7 or above, which would register as a high. What I will say is where we sometimes see a 7, it's not necessarily due to air pollution. It can be due to, for example, the equipment has been taken offline and gas cylinders are being replaced. So you can have an artificially high reading for a very, very short period of time. But we, colleagues in the council, you can usually identify those based on it's incredibly localised or there was work being done at the cabinet at that time. So because something is a high reading, it doesn't mean that it is a genuine air pollution issue.
Imagine it's sensitive enough to pick up environmental changes too. So if there's like literally something like a global event, like the volcano that erupted a number of years ago, a freak weather event, the sand that comes from the Sahara at times and stuff.
We do see the Sahara
and then
dust, yeah.
The final point, and this is what Daniel's getting to, I'm going to bring John in because John's been very patient, is this committee is very interested in odour pollution,
right,
which must be, I think, is in some ways going to be linked to air quality in times, and we're concerned that the councils use the sniff test in regards to that, and Daniel's point was well made. There's kind of Monday to Friday if you're available, and so we think I would assume that there's going to be some correlation. I know this is a common framework which is high level, but at the same time it's the people, our constituents, that we're obviously representing. So John, thank you very much.
Chair, if some concern we're straying into much more detailed discussion when we clearly don't have the data sets in front of us, and where we don't have immediately either access to the relevant business areas and officials who might be able to provide the information required. So beyond a chat, it's not going to achieve any definitive outcome. Can I ask for clarification if we are getting information, those data sets will relate to all of the councils across Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
And at that point, could I suggest, and it's not for today to determine this, that's when we have a look at either a further conversation with the Air and Environmental Quality branch and or the Shared Environmental Services unit for local government that we probably haven't accessed very frequently, if at all, and that we were discussing recently in relation to odour.
With the calling for
see who we need to speak to in relation to getting a clearer picture, pardon the pun, of the air quality issue. On this one and on the report in front of us, can I ask you a couple of things? First of all, given the disparity presented by Northern Ireland circumstances in relation to some air quality issues, ammonia levels, for example, in Northern Ireland account for 12% of the UK total. We have 3% of the population, 6% of the land area. Is there any evidence that the frameworks that we're discussing could help shape our policies towards doing better in that regard? I suppose short version of that is pressure applied because we're in those frameworks with other regions also?
This air quality framework doesn't apply to ammonia. It covers the pollutants that are covered by the CAFE directive. So it's legislation and things like nitrogen dioxide, PM10, PM2.5, sulfur, ozone. It's carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide. So ammonia would fall outside of the framework.
Pollutants determined in the frameworks are what we're talking about here. There's a list of defined.
Yes. Under the legislation that's included within the framework.
I noticed there though that incineration, waste incineration is included. I know there have been some concerns expressed about pollutants from those. More broadly, and personal views, you need to be careful about how many of these you start to develop if you've already got capacity there that isn't being fully utilised, and that most certainly seems to be the case in Northern Ireland. But that's an area, for example, where we could tap into the expertise of the other regions if the framework's looking at that. Is that the case?
Waste incineration on the framework, does that come under ED or is it outside the scope?
Yes, it would fall under the Industrial Emissions Directive. Yes, under this framework there is some small industry reporting under this framework, but that would fall, most of that would fall under the IED in relation to the Industrial Emissions Common Framework. It wouldn't actually fall under the scope of this.
This would give us access to information as well as any concerns that were arising in other regions.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's helpful.
Thank you very much, John. And William, you had indicated?
Yeah. Is air quality monitoring in the 4 regions of the UK? Do they compare? Do we know which is the worst to the best to the worst in relation to air quality? Is that
As
public knowledge?
We don't have a rating system as such. There's different ways you can look at the data, and it very much depends on what pollutant you're looking at and in what area and over what averaging time, whether you're looking at an annual average or a 24-hour average for a specific pollutant. But if there are certain areas or pollutants that you're interested in, we can certainly interrogate the website, which is our data repository, and come back if you have specific questions on that.
We had some concerns about divergence. Is there a potential for areas of divergence?
There is potential for divergence under the Air Quality Common Framework, but the focus on that divergence is to make sure we get regional specific protection in place for air quality. So it would be positive, it would be focused in on pollutants that were maybe more problematic in Northern Ireland, which could be related to solid fuel burning or vehicle emissions from cars, which maybe wouldn't be just as big a problem in a small region in Scotland, for example. So the divergence is possible, but hopefully it's seen as a flexibility within the framework.
Okay.
Just in relation to your previous question, there is a UK-wide annual air quality report which contains a lot of information looking at where across the UK certain limit values, air quality standards or objectives or target values have been exceeded. So that may be of some help, but if there are specific instances, areas or pollutants you'd like us to look at, we'll happily interrogate the data and come back to committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you, members. Just finally then, in terms of a timeline for the committee to be fair to the department, when would the department require a response from the committee?
Your earliest convenience.
Okay. And if you don't mind, I'm going to, in speaking to the committee, members content that we get a bit more information, maybe through a raised paper on that. There's been a couple of, we've asked for obviously the data sets, which is possibly available online, but it would be good for us as a committee to see those pulled together. And then I'm going to ask the clerk just to set aside another bit of time then in regard to return to this so the committee can give an informed response. Are members content with that?
Sure, and I think I need to be clear, there is information we're seeking. Is it in relation to these frameworks or is it in relation to local government responsibilities across Northern Ireland? So they would be two very separate things.
Okay, so it's
there's no reason why we couldn't deal.
So specifically in regards to, because in this regard, from my perspective, I'll speak this out then, is regard, so I think in this jurisdiction we're slightly different because we have the Windsor framework. Other departments and their ministers are concerned with their jurisdiction. We have an extra complication here because of the Windsor framework. There may be no implications, I think, but for confidence and as Declan has raised, we're also the negotiations with our counterparts in the Republic. It's slightly different here, slightly different for our department than the Scottish, Welsh and English. So in that regard, that would be my sort of reach in to raise just to see how that might play out, if members are content with that. That's not necessarily for you guys, but let you know what we're up to here. I'm trying to be helpful, if that's okay. Are members content with that approach? Thank you, John, for that there. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, members, I've just asked the clerk to ensure that that's in our forward work diary and a little bit of work for Reyes then. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 9, consideration of the end of session report, members. Referring to pages 107 to 126 of the pack for the report. A copy of the report was provided for last week's meeting when we agreed to return to it this week. So what I'm going to suggest, members, is that we go into a very short closed session to consider that report. So if we could, we will return back in at 12:10 sharp, so we'll take 10 minutes.
Can we just confirm that decision, please, in open?
Surely, no problem. Okay, members, before we move on to agenda item 10, to close agenda item 9 out, which is the closed session to consider the end of session 24-25 report, members were content and it will be published as has been provided to the members. Thank you very much, members. Okay, agenda item 10 is correspondence. Refer to page 128 of the pack to the member for the clerk to the Public Accounts Committee, dated the 10th of October regarding the NIO report on major capital projects. Follow-up report. The PAC published its report on 27th of March and is seeking an update from the Comptroller Auditor General, CNAG, on the A5 case study, which forms part of the report and retains primacy until the memorandum of reply has been led in Assembly. PAC is aware of our joint work in this matter with the Infrastructure Committee and wish to advise of its continued interest in the A5 to avoid any potential duplication of work, and will keep us informed of any relevant updates. When we're communicating with the Public Accounts Committee, one of the registration of interest will be our member, Daniel McCarron, who is the chair of that committee. Are you content to note that, members?
Yeah.
Thank you, members. Members are referred to pages 130 to 137 of the pack for the 47th Examiner of Statutory Rules report dated the 10th of October. The report refers to SR 25-161, the Agricultural Schemes Amendment Regulations, Northern Ireland 2025, which has not been drawn to the attention of the Assembly. Are you content to note? Thank you, members. Members are referred to pages 138 to 141 of the pact. Correspondence dated 1st of October from an individual regarding notification that they will not meet the eligibility criteria to qualify for the Farm Sustainability Payment Scheme. I will note that the committee do not, as a rule, take up individual cases. However, are you content for the content of the clerk to respond on behalf of the committee?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Members, agenda item 11, forward work plan. I refer you to page 118 to 121 of the table papers for the draft forward work programme. Are you content that this is published? Yep. Members, any other business? No. Okay. Members, date and time of next meeting. Next committee meeting is next Thursday, 23rd of October. It's in the Titanic Hotel. Remember, the Titanic Hotel is not here. It's part of the wider conference on energy. Okay. The meet.
And officials will send instructions for parking.
Oh yes, there'll be instructions for parking. And how that's going to run. Okay, members? Okay, the meeting is now adjourned.